The gaslight flickered against the damp stone walls of Windsor Castle as Queen Victoria clutched the cold hand of her dying husband. It was December 1861, and the most powerful woman in the world was about to become a widow at 42 years old. Prince Albert's breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, his body ravaged by typhoid fever, a disease born from the filthy water systems that plagued even the grandest palaces of the age. Outside, the Thames ran black with sewage. Inside, the queen of an empire upon which the sun never set watched helplessly as the man she loved more than her crown slipped away into darkness. She would wear black for the remaining 40 years of her life, transforming the monarchy into a monument of mourning. But this moment of devastating loss was merely one thread in a tapestry of madness, tragedy, and scandal that had defined the British royal family for generations. The Victorian era, stretching from 1837 to 1901, witnessed an empire at the height of its power. Yet behind the gilt-edged portraits and ceremonial splendor lay a family plagued by haemophilia, mental illness, political intrigue, and secrets that would shock the nation. The royals lived in a world of gaslit ballrooms and rigid protocol, but they were as vulnerable to human suffering as the poorest chimney sweep struggling to survive in the East End slums. Their blood was not blue, it was red, and sometimes it refused to clot. Before we journey deeper into this extraordinary tale of power, madness, and tragedy, I want to take a moment to invite you to join our community. If you're fascinated by the hidden histories that textbooks often overlook, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to light, uncovering the truth behind the crown jewels and velvet curtains. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another chapter of history's most compelling narratives. Now, let us return to the gaslit corridors of Victorian power, where nothing was quite as it seemed. To understand the madness that would grip Queen Victoria's household, we must first travel back to the reign of her grandfather, King George III, whose descent into insanity became one of the most infamous chapters in British royal history. George III ruled from 1760 to 1820, presiding over Britain during the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the dawn of the Industrial Age. He was, by most accounts, a dedicated king and devoted family man. Yet beginning in 1788, the king began exhibiting behavior that terrified his court and family alike. The episodes began with physical symptoms: excruciating abdominal pain, racing pulse, and dark-colored urine. Then came the mental deterioration. The king would speak for hours without pause, his sentences becoming increasingly incoherent, jumping from topic to topic with manic energy. He would foam at the mouth and physically attack members of his household. During one particularly disturbing episode, he attempted to assault his own son, the Prince of Wales, believing him to be a political conspirator. Palace physicians, working with the primitive medical knowledge of the 18th century, had no understanding of what afflicted their monarch. The treatments administered to George III were medieval in their brutality. He was placed in a straitjacket, sometimes for hours at a time. He was subjected to blistering, a process where caustic substances were applied to his skin to raise painful blisters, based on the misguided theory that this would draw out the bad humors, causing his illness. He was purged and bled repeatedly. His head was shaved and covered with mustard plasters. During his lucid moments, the king was fully aware of what was being done to him, aware of his own helplessness, aware that his dignity as monarch had been stripped away. Modern medical historians now believe George III suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can produce both the physical and psychological symptoms the king displayed. The disease would appear in periodic episodes, sometimes allowing for months or years of normalcy between attacks. During his final decade, from 1810 to 1820, George III descended into permanent madness, spending his last years in isolation at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and unable to recognize even his closest family members. He would wander the corridors in a stained dressing gown, his white beard grown long and unkempt, talking to people who had been dead for years. The man who had once commanded an empire ended his days as a ghost in his own palace. This spectre of madness haunted the royal bloodline. George III's son, who served as Prince Regent during his father's incapacity and later became George IV, was a man of enormous appetites and equally enormous flaws. He was brilliant, cultured, and utterly dissolute. He spent money with reckless abandon, building the extravagant Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a fantastical palace inspired by Indian and Chinese architecture that scandalized more conservative members of society. His relationship with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was catastrophic from the start. Upon meeting her for the first time, George reportedly called for brandy and staggered away, appalled by her appearance and hygiene. The marriage, arranged for political purposes, was consummated only a handful of times, just enough to produce a single child, Princess Charlotte. George spent the rest of his marriage trying to rid himself of Caroline, eventually attempting to divorce her on grounds of adultery when he became king. The resulting scandal transfixed the nation. Caroline returned to England to claim her rightful place as queen, and the public, despising George for his extravagance and cruelty, rallied to her defence. The divorce proceedings, known as the Pains and Penalties Bill, aired the most intimate and sordid details of the royal marriage before Parliament. Though the bill eventually passed the House of Lords, it was withdrawn due to overwhelming public opposition. Caroline died shortly thereafter, some say of a broken heart, others of an intestinal obstruction. George denied her entry to his coronation. He died in 1830, bloated with dropsy, addicted to laudanum, despised by his subjects. His brother William IV succeeded him, ruling briefly until 1837. William was a bluff, somewhat crude naval man who had fathered 10 illegitimate children with an Irish actress before finally marrying late in life. His legitimate children all died in infancy or early childhood, leaving the succession to pass to his niece, the young Princess Victoria. Victoria ascended to the throne at just 18 years old, awakened in the early morning hours of June 20th, 1837, to be told that her uncle had died, and she was now queen. She received the news in her nightgown, her first act as monarch performed in bare feet on the cold floor of Kensington Palace. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, young, and entirely untested. Few could have predicted she would give her name to an entire era, reshaping the monarchy and presiding over the transformation of Britain into the world's first industrial superpower. Yet Victoria's childhood had been far from happy. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died when she was less than a year old, leaving her to be raised by her German mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy. They subjected young Victoria to what became known as the Kensington system, a regime of isolation and control designed to keep her dependent and malleable. She was never allowed to be alone, forced to sleep in her mother's bedroom until the day she became queen. She was forbidden from meeting people without supervision. She was constantly reminded of her inadequacy and told she was not strong enough to rule without guidance. This oppressive upbringing created in Victoria a fierce determination for independence. On the day she became queen, she ordered that her bed be moved to her own room for the first time in her life. She banished Conroy from court. She kept her mother at arm's length for years. The experience left psychological scars that would influence her relationships for decades to come. Victoria's salvation came in the form of her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their marriage in 1840 was initially met with some skepticism. Albert was German, penniless by royal standards, and Parliament refused to grant him the title of king consort. But the marriage proved to be one of genuine love and partnership. Victoria was passionately, almost obsessively devoted to Albert. Her journals overflow with descriptions of his beauty, his intelligence, his virtue. He was her angel, her beloved lord and master. Albert transformed the monarchy. He was brilliant, serious, and progressive. He championed the arts and sciences, educational reform, and technological advancement. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the spectacular Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, was largely Albert's creation, a celebration of industrial innovation that attracted 6 million visitors and showcased Britain's dominance in the modern world. The Crystal Palace itself was a marvel, a cathedral of iron and glass that seemed to capture the optimism of the age. But Albert was never fully accepted by British society. He remained the German in the eyes of many aristocrats. He was excluded from seeing state papers for years. The stress of his position, combined with his constitutional weakness and tendency to overwork, began to take a physical toll. He suffered from chronic stomach problems, insomnia, and debilitating anxieties. The couple had 9 children together, births that Victoria found traumatic and degrading. She hated being pregnant, calling it the shadow side of marriage. She was one of the first women to use chloroform during childbirth, helping to legitimize pain relief during delivery despite opposition from religious conservatives who believed women should suffer as punishment for Eve's sin. After each birth, Victoria would sink into what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, though such concepts were not understood in Victorian medicine. Victoria and Albert's children were destined to be married off to the great royal houses of Europe, a strategy designed to create a network of British influence across the continent. But this strategy would have devastating consequences, for Victoria was a carrier of haemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. The disease is carried on the X chromosome, meaning that women who carry the gene typically do not suffer symptoms but can pass the disease to their sons, who will suffer its full effects. Daughters of carriers have a 50% chance of being carriers themselves. Haemophilia earned the grim nickname the royal disease because Victoria's descendants spread it through the royal houses of Europe. Her 8th child, Prince Leopold, suffered from the disease. Any minor injury could trigger uncontrolled bleeding. Leopold lived in constant danger, his childhood marked by painful joint hemorrhages and the constant fear that a simple fall or bump might prove fatal. He survived to adulthood through careful management, married and fathered 2 children before dying at age 30 from a brain hemorrhage following a minor fall. But the true devastation of haemophilia would be felt in the next generation. Victoria's daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were both carriers. Alice's son Friedrich died at age 3 from a hemorrhage following a fall from a window. Her daughter Alex became Empress of Russia through her marriage to Tsar Nicholas II, and her son, the heir to the Russian throne, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered terribly from haemophilia. The desperate attempts to treat Alexei's condition led to the rise of the mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the imperial family contributed to the instability that eventually brought down the Romanov dynasty in the Russian Revolution. Princess Beatrice's sons Leopold and Maurice both suffered from haemophilia. Leopold died at 33, following a routine surgery. Maurice was killed in action during World War I at age 23, though whether he died from his wounds or from bleeding complications remains unclear. The tragedy rippled outward. Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie, became Queen of Spain, and 2 of her sons inherited haemophilia. The disease haunted the family like a curse from a Gothic novel. But let us return to that December night in 1861, to Windsor Castle and the death of Prince Albert. The prince had been unwell for weeks, suffering from what his doctors initially dismissed as a bad cold or influenza. He had recently dealt with an enormous stress, the discovery that his eldest son, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, had been involved in a sexual liaison with an actress while training with the army in Ireland. Albert, whose own morality was rigidly Victorian, was devastated. He travelled to Cambridge in miserable weather to confront Bertie, becoming thoroughly soaked and chilled. His condition rapidly deteriorated. Fever set in. He developed severe respiratory distress. Modern doctors now believe he was suffering from typhoid fever, contracted from the notoriously unsanitary conditions at Windsor Castle itself. The castle's drains were primitive, and contaminated water was a constant threat even to royalty. For 2 weeks, doctors attended Albert as he slowly died. Victoria remained at his bedside, watching helplessly as her husband, only 42 years old, in what should have been the prime of his life, wasted away. On December 14th, 1861, at 10:50 in the evening, Albert died. Victoria's anguished screams echoed through the castle. She collapsed over his body, refusing to leave his side for hours. When she finally emerged from the death chamber, her life as she had known it was over. She retreated into an obsessive mourning that would scandalize her ministers and distance her from her subjects for decades. Victoria ordered that Albert's rooms be maintained exactly as they were on the day he died. His clothes were laid out daily. His shaving water was brought in fresh each morning. No object could be moved. She wore nothing but black mourning dress for the remaining 40 years of her life, refusing to appear at public ceremonies and earning the bitter nickname, the Widow of Windsor. She commissioned hundreds of monuments to Albert, statues, memorials, buildings. The Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, that extraordinary Gothic confection of gilt and mosaic, became a shrine to her obsessive grief. Her withdrawal from public life created a constitutional crisis. Britain was a constitutional monarchy, and the Queen's ceremonial duties were essential to maintaining public support for the institution. Yet Victoria refused to perform them. She remained secluded at Windsor, Balmoral, or Osborne House, emerging only rarely. Republican sentiment began to grow. Pamphlets circulated asking why the nation should support a queen who refused to serve her people. Her government begged her to show herself, to open Parliament, to appear at public events. She refused, citing her overwhelming grief and fragile health. Part of Victoria's retreat was genuine grief, but part was also manipulation. She had discovered that by claiming poor health and emotional fragility, she could avoid duties she disliked and maintain control over government decisions she cared about. She read all state papers religiously and insisted on being consulted about every significant decision. She feuded with her prime ministers, particularly William Gladstone, whom she detested. She sent hectoring letters and telegrams, demanded explanations, and used every ounce of her influence to shape policy despite her claimed invalidity. Meanwhile, her children were growing into troubled adults. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, had never been forgiven for the affair Victoria blamed for Albert's death. He was denied any meaningful role in government, despite being heir to the throne. Denied purpose, he threw himself into pleasure. Gambling, horse racing, shooting parties, and a succession of mistresses. His marriage to the beautiful Princess Alexandra of Denmark produced 6 children, but Bertie continued his affairs openly, including a notorious liaison with Lily Langtry, the famous actress. He was subpoenaed to testify in divorce cases involving his friends, dragging the monarchy through scandal. Victoria despaired of him, calling him weak and self-indulgent, but she also refused to give him responsibilities that might have channeled his energy productively. Her second son, Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, made a respectable naval career, but struggled with alcoholism. His only son shot himself at age 24 during his parents' silver wedding anniversary celebration. Alfred himself died of throat cancer at 55. Victoria's third son, Arthur, Duke of Connaught, led a fairly conventional military career. Her fourth son, Leopold, as we have seen, suffered from haemophilia and died young. Her daughters fared little better. Vicky, the eldest, married the Crown Prince of Prussia and became German Empress for 99 days before her husband died of throat cancer. Her son Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm II, would lead Germany into World War I, fighting against his British cousins. Vicky's letters reveal a brilliant, frustrated woman trapped in a hostile court, watching helplessly as her liberal ideals were crushed by German militarism. She died of cancer at 60, the same disease that killed her husband. Princess Alice married the Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, and lived in relative poverty by royal standards. She nursed her husband and children through a diphtheria epidemic in 1878, only to contract the disease herself after kissing her youngest son in a moment of maternal tenderness. She died on December 14th, 1878, exactly 17 years after her father's death. Victoria was convinced the timing proved that Alice had died of a broken heart. The younger daughters, Helena, Louise, and Beatrice, were kept close to home, their marriages delayed or discouraged so they could serve as companions to their mother. Helena married a much older German prince and lived in England, serving as Victoria's secretary. Louise married a Scottish duke and was rumoured to have had affairs and possibly an illegitimate child. Beatrice married late, and only after promising never to leave her mother's side. After her husband died of fever during a military expedition, she devoted herself entirely to Victoria, becoming her primary caretaker in the Queen's final years. As Victoria aged, the world around her transformed utterly. When she took the throne in 1837, Britain was still largely rural, powered by muscle and water. By the time she died in 1901, it was an industrial giant, connected by railways and telegraphs, its cities lit by electric light. The empire she ruled expanded to encompass a quarter of the world's population. Yet she remained in many ways a woman of the earlier era, resistant to change, clinging to the values and prejudices of her youth. The latter part of Victoria's reign saw her emerge partially from seclusion, particularly after 1887, when her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, created an outpouring of public affection that surprised even her most optimistic advisers. The celebrations revealed that despite her long withdrawal, the British people still loved their Queen. The Diamond Jubilee 10 years later, in 1897, was even more spectacular. Victoria, by then quite elderly and nearly blind with cataracts, rode through the streets of London in an open carriage, receiving the adulation of millions. The Empire celebrated with her. Telegrams arrived from every corner of the globe, from Canada to India to Australia. But beneath the pageantry, Victoria was failing. She suffered from rheumatism, could barely walk, and had to be carried from room to room. She was increasingly senile, forgetting where she was or repeating herself endlessly. Her court became a peculiar mixture of cutting-edge modernity, telephones, electric lights, automobiles, and medieval ritual. She insisted on maintaining every tradition exactly as Albert would have wanted, even as the world modernized around her. Victoria's relationship with her youngest daughter Beatrice became increasingly fraught. Beatrice had essentially sacrificed her life to her mother's service, and Victoria repaid this devotion with imperious demands and constant criticism. When Beatrice finally published edited versions of Victoria's journals after her death, she burned the originals, destroying invaluable historical records. Some historians believe this was an act of revenge, erasing her mother's most intimate thoughts in retaliation for years of emotional manipulation. In Victoria's final years, she found unexpected comfort in an Indian servant named Abdul Karim, whom she called the Munshi, teacher. Abdul taught her Urdu and Hindi, served as her confidential clerk, and became one of her closest companions. The relationship scandalized the royal household. The Queen's children and courtiers viewed Abdul as an upstart taking advantage of a senile old woman. They resented his influence and spread rumors about his character. Victoria defended him fiercely, but after her death, the family ensured that almost all traces of Abdul were erased from the royal record, his letters and gifts burned or destroyed. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 81 years old and had reigned for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. Her final word was Bertie, the son she had blamed for Albert's death and kept at arm's length for 40 years. She had left specific instructions for her burial. She was to be dressed in white, not black. In her coffin were placed Albert's dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand, and numerous photographs and mementos. But she also included items her family knew nothing about until they prepared her body: photographs and a lock of hair from John Brown, her Scottish servant who had been her closest companion for decades and whom many suspected had been secretly her husband. John Brown was perhaps the greatest scandal of Victoria's widowhood, though the full truth remains uncertain to this day. Brown was a Highland servant who had served Prince Albert and who became the Queen's personal attendant after Albert's death. He was rough, blunt-spoken, and utterly devoted to Victoria. Rumours flew that they had secretly married, that he was her lover, that she had borne his child. Newspapers called her Mrs. Brown. The relationship was certainly emotionally intimate, perhaps even dependent. Brown was the only person who could coax Victoria from her deepest depressions, who could make her laugh, who could speak to her without the suffocating protocol that surrounded her every other interaction. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria's grief rivaled her mourning for Albert. She wanted to erect public monuments to him, to publish his biography, to have him commemorated alongside her husband. Her children and ministers prevented her, horrified at the scandal it would cause. But privately, she mourned him deeply and kept his memory alive in her apartments and her heart. The Victorian era that ended with the Queen's death was one of stark contrasts. It was an age of unprecedented progress and crushing poverty, of moral righteousness and hidden vice, of global empire built on exploitation and suffering. The royal family embodied these contradictions. They were the symbolic heart of the nation, yet plagued by hereditary disease, mental instability, and personal tragedy. They lived in palaces but could not escape the typhoid, diphtheria, and haemophilia that killed rich and poor alike. They commanded armies but could not control their own children or their own blood. The legacy of Queen Victoria's reign extended far beyond her lifetime. Her descendants occupied the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, Greece, Norway, and Sweden, creating a vast family network across Europe. But this network would be torn apart by the catastrophe of World War I, when Victoria's grandchildren found themselves on opposite sides of the bloodiest conflict in human history. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, all grandsons of Victoria, presided over the slaughter of millions, the collapse of empires, and the end of the old European order. The haemophilia that Victoria unknowingly carried in her blood would contribute to the fall of the Russian monarchy. The Tsarina Alexandra's desperate attempts to cure her son's haemophilia made her vulnerable to Rasputin's influence, which in turn poisoned the reputation of the imperial family and contributed to the revolutionary atmosphere that led to the Bolshevik Revolution. When the Romanovs were executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg in July 1918, bullets and bayonets finally ended the suffering of the young Tsarevich Alexei, whose illness had been inherited from his great-grandmother Victoria through his mother, Alexandra. The Victorian royal family's story is ultimately a human one, a reminder that crowns and palaces do not protect against loss, grief, mental illness, or genetic disease. Behind the formal portraits and state ceremonies were real people struggling with the same fundamental challenges that face all human beings: love and loss, parent-child conflicts, mental and physical illness, the search for meaning and purpose. They made terrible mistakes and caused considerable suffering, both within their family and through the imperial policies they represented. Yet they also experienced genuine love, grief, joy, and sorrow. The gaslight that illuminated Windsor Castle on the night Prince Albert died has long since been replaced by electric bulbs, and those too have been updated countless times. The Victorian era recedes further into history with each passing year, but the human story at its heart, of a woman who loved and lost, of children who disappointed their parents and parents who failed their children, of a family both extraordinary and painfully ordinary, remains compelling. In the end, perhaps that is the most shocking revelation of all, that even the royal family, draped in ermine and weighted with crowns, could not escape the fundamental tragedy and beauty of being human. Their blood ran red, their hearts broke, and their children died, just like the poorest subjects in their vast empire. The throne was no protection against fate, and all the power in the world could not save them from themselves.